Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Leveling the Playing Field, How a U.S. Carbon Border Adjustment Can Reduce Carbon Pollution Around the World. Today's special guest speaker is Catrina Rorke. This event is presented by republicEn and the Climate Leadership Council. My name is Wen Lee. Thank you all so much for being here today to be part of this very important discussion. So just to give a really quick rundown of what's happening today, we're going to start off with a very brief orientation and welcome, and then we'll dive straight into our speaker presentation. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A and make sure we get all your questions answered. So I think that you are all very familiar with Zoom, but remember there is a chat function, and this is where we encourage you all to submit questions, write comments, and let's just get things going right now by having everyone say hi in the chat and say your name and what city you're joining us from. So I'll start. I'll say hi. Okay, there we go. And make sure you're sending it to everyone, so everyone can see. So go ahead and tell us your name and where you're joining us from. And just to make sure the chat works, and also just so you have it open. All right. Cincinnati, DC, Colorado, Pennsylvania, New York, Kentucky, Texas, Orlando. Wonderful. Wow, we have people from all over. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay, so this is where you can submit questions for Catrina Rorke at any time during the presentation or during Q&A. So just put in your question and the republicEn staff will actually collect all the questions. And at the end, we're going to go through as many of them as we can. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is co-presented by republicEn.org as well as Climate Leadership Council. So if you're not familiar with republicEn, we are a nonprofit organization for conservatives who want to solve climate change through common sense market solutions. We call our growing movement the Eco Rights. And I hope you all will join our community and take action with us. The Climate Leadership Council has a mission to promote effective, fair, and lasting climate solutions based on the Carbon Dividends Plan. They believe that by acting with a sensible plan, we can use the power of American ingenuity to address the climate problem. And last week, actually, the council launched the Center for Climate and Trade, a new program that will explore and advance policies that leverage trade relationships and the global market economy towards greater international cooperation and climate ambition. So we are so delighted to co-present this webinar with them today, and we're very, very, very happy to have Catrina with us as well. Catrina Rorke is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council. At this time, I would actually like to pass the mic to former Congressman and republicEn's Executive Director, Bob Inglis, who's going to say a few words. Go ahead, Bob.
Thanks, Wen, and thank you all for joining us here today. I'm especially excited to have Catrina with us. When you look at a bio and need to introduce somebody, usually they start at the top and go to the bottom. I'm going to start at the bottom and go to the top because there's something we got to get over right away, which is that she went to college, unfortunately, right down the street from Durham, North Carolina, at a place called Chapel Hill, North Carolina. But we can forgive that. We can move along from that. And then, of course, she got a Master of Public Administration from Columbia University and ended up in Washington working with NOAA as a presidential management fellow at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. Now, that's when the story intersects with mine, because Catrina was detailed to our office, the 4th District office, 4th District of South Carolina. And we stole her fair and square from NOAA. We realized how good she was, and they made the mistake of putting her in our office. And so we stole her, got into a literal bidding war with NOAA to try to keep Catrina, and we won. And that led to her writing with Garth Van Meter, my legislative director at the time, and Wayne Roper, my chief of staff, the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009, which was a revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon tax. Then Catrina went on to even more famous things. She was at the with the folks at American Action Forum and then R Street, and now she's senior vice president at Climate Leadership Council, and is doing fabulous work, particularly on this question of trade and how carbon pricing would actually be good news for us in America. And so, especially for that reason, I'm very glad for Catrina's work, and very glad that she's our friend. And so, welcome, Catrina. Thank you for being part of this.
Thanks, Bob. You might be a dookie, but I've been working on border carbon adjustments because of the foresight that you had to include both import and export adjustments in the carbon price bill, which was novel at the time. I remember Garth and I tracked down a book that had mention of a footnote to a WTO annex document, and that is what we had to hang on for the export adjustment. What a long way we have come. But thank you very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen so that I don't get off track as we talk about border carbon adjustments and what happens when we align climate and trade more closely. We're going to use the language about leveling the playing field. I think that sounds a little bit modest for what we can achieve if we start thinking more seriously about using trade tools to address the climate challenge. As Wen said, last week we launched this Center for Climate and Trade, and it's a forum that's going to let us explore this nexus in more detail and move past talking about one policy, the border carbon adjustment, and think a little bit more broadly about the opportunities here. But as promised, I'll start by talking about the border carbon adjustment with mention of these other trade tools. And then I want to talk about why leveling the playing field is so vital and all of the benefits that we'll be able to unlock by connecting our domestic climate policy with trade tools and level up on global ambition. Let's start with border adjustments. So domestic environmental policies impose costs borne by businesses, households, taxpayers. These costs are associated with cutting carbon emissions and investing in the energy transition. Imported goods don't necessarily come from countries with similar environmental controls. And as a result, there's an imbalance in the costs associated with producing the goods that we use every day. In the United States, we have a high environmental ambition. We import the vast majority of our goods from countries with lower environmental ambition baked into their regulatory systems, market-based programs. And as a consequence, goods that we import from those countries don't face the same incremental environmental costs. At the same time, because we have high standards for environmental performance in the United States, the goods that we export have higher embedded environmental costs than the goods they'll compete with on the global market. So a border carbon adjustment levels the playing field. It does that by charging imports for the carbon emissions associated with their manufacture and by refunding exports for any domestic carbon costs paid. And that allows all goods sold in the US and internationally to bear the same carbon costs. When that happens, it's US businesses, it's clean firms that get a leg up on the competition. For our visual learners, we'll break it down a little bit right here. So imported goods. They're going to come from jurisdictions that don't necessarily have the environmental and climate policies that we would in the United States, right? If we have a domestic carbon fee in the US, we're importing goods from countries without such a fee, we'll be able to add on to those goods the carbon fee that they would have paid if they made that good domestically. So level playing field. In the US, our firms will be paying a carbon fee. When you export goods from these facilities, you want to roll back that carbon fee so that they're on a level playing field in the international market. Note that the goods we make in the US will be making those under a system with higher environmental controls, which means they're going to enter the global market cleaner than their competitors. And because we roll back the cost of compliance with a domestic carbon fee, they'll be on a level playing field and more competitive against dirtier goods made overseas. It's a powerful instrument, and it lets us accomplish a variety of things that we'll talk about later. But I want to leave space in the conversation to recognize that there are other tools that help bridge climate policy to trade policy. We hear a lot about carbon clubs, multilateral arrangements where we agree on like carbon prices or like environmental ambition. And that way we can have trade between club countries that have no adjustments in them. It's another tool at our disposal. Section 232 restrictions were used by the Trump administration for national security purposes to protect domestic steel and aluminum manufacturers. We've seen the Biden administration renegotiate some of those deals with climate consequences in mind, which means we can use an existing trade tool and build in consideration for climate impacts. I've heard some trade attorneys argue that the imbalance between environmental standards between the US and other countries overseas might be considered to be some kind of a subsidy. And if this subsidy exists, maybe we can countervail it and associate anti-dumping and countervailing duties with goods made in countries with lower environmental standards than we have. We can apply performance standards. So if the good that you import is about as carbon efficient as its US made competitor, no additional adjustment at the border. But if it's dirtier, maybe we can impose some measure of a tariff or carbon cost as goods come in. So there are a variety of tools. We don't yet have as sophisticated as a policy development process in the works. But that's one of the things that we'll be doing at the Center for Climate and Trade, is trying to figure out what the menu can and should look like so that we're reconciling climate ambition and trade more broadly. But let's talk about the opportunities here. So what happens when we level the playing field? The first thing we get to do is monetize the US carbon advantage. Listeners to Eco Right Speaks will have heard me talk about this before, but we've done really terrific research here at the Council that uncovered a sort of understated fact of existing modes of production, which is that in the US, we make it cleaner. So here I have relative carbon intensities for a broad basket of goods produced in the US. We set US carbon intensity to 1, and then we compare it against other competitors. So here we have the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. We have the USMCA partners, the European Union, and a global average. The number one takeaway from this is that on average, the global economy is 80% more carbon intensive than the US economy. That means when we make something in the United States, it's with 44% lower emissions than international competitors on average. China, India, Russia take 3 to 4 times the amount of carbon emissions to create the same dollar of value. And this is persistent across a broad basket of goods. Minerals to microchips to motor vehicles, the US does it better and cleaner. We cannot monetize this carbon advantage with existing policies, but it already exists. It's on the table, just need policies to develop it. And what happens if we do? We had the data to study what happens in the US steel industry if we introduce a domestic carbon fee and a border carbon adjustment. And the consequences are tremendous. The US steel industry is the cleanest supplier of steel to the US market. That means if we implement the carbon fee and border adjustment, those are the firms that end up winning. Under this system, we would cut imports of steel in half from dirtier overseas competitors. We would increase sales of US made product on the order of 10%, in our model that maxed out available capacity in the US. And we increase the profitability of US firms by on the order of 40%. So here we have a climate tool creating new competitive opportunity for existing US businesses, even carbon intensive US businesses. Again, this is an existing advantage that we're presently leaving on the table. We'll also be able to unlock global climate ambition. Those who follow border carbon adjustments may have heard this term carbon leakage, which is this circumstance in which there are environmental controls in one country, and so manufacturers and investments or flows overseas to lower carbon price jurisdictions with lower environmental standards to avoid carbon pricing. This is it's a minor part of the problem because carbon leakage can't capture what we understand now to be the carbon loophole, which is that a full 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the manufacture of a good in one country for the consumption of that good in another. The carbon loophole is a very significant part of the global climate conversation, and there are no tools to address it. Since 2005, global climate emissions have increased 25%. 90% of that increase can be associated with the BRIC countries, with Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And that's because the emissions associated with those economies get embedded in the carbon loophole in the form of goods consumed elsewhere. So in the US, we import about 10%, less than 10% of our emissions, which means we're bringing goods into the US that weren't manufactured here, and that sort of boosts the amount of carbon that we consume in the US. In the European Union and the United Kingdom, that number is more stark. On the order of 30% of their emissions are embedded in the goods that they import from overseas. So the European Union, the UK, the US, we can establish net zero targets by mid-century, but those targets are meaningless unless we develop policy tools to address this growing section of emissions embedded in the carbon loophole. Can also promote international cooperation. To date, the US has expressed interest in tools at the climate and trade nexus. The European Union has introduced its carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we've heard interest from Canada, the UK, and Japan in doing something at the climate and trade nexus to address the emissions associated with trading goods. Taken together, that's 53% of the global economy. So this isn't a minor subset of nations moving forward with a wonky idea. This is the future of the global trading system. These countries will leverage their combined market power to drive down global emissions, to create a new incentive structure where the most competitive goods are the cleanest. This is also an opportunity to outmaneuver our rivals. We'll get to this in questions, but there are a basket of countries that use the resources that they have as leverage for geopolitical purposes in the global market. So China is the dominant global supplier of rare earth elements, important inputs to things like batteries for electric vehicles, to microchips for wind turbines. Rare earth elements are being bought up by the clean energy economy at unprecedented levels. But the manufacture of rare earth elements in China is twice as carbon intensive as those same materials made in the US and EU. which means clean energy supply chains are dependent on one of the dirtiest sources for this key input because we don't have policies to address the emissions associated with traded goods. Russia is the dominant energy supplier to Europe. Russian energy supplies are twice as carbon intensive as US energy supplies and 70% more methane intensive than US energy supplies, which means Europe is dependent on a dirtier supplier of energy with more geopolitical leverage. And yes, we'll talk about this in questions. But what an opportunity here to use a climate policy to increase global climate ambition, grow more close to our international partners, and find ways to outmaneuver our rivals that use their dirtier resources as a point of leverage. There's also bipartisan support. The council has done polling in swing states and identified really widespread support for policies like a border carbon adjustment as part of a national climate strategy. 86% of voters say that US climate policy needs to ensure that other countries do their part. Climate and trade policies will do that. 75% of voters are willing to pay a little bit more for their goods if it helps make sure that those goods are made with lower emissions and in the United States. So there's opportunity for us here. And the political conversation is reflecting that. The White House has made a commitment to use the trade tools at its disposal to address climate emissions. We talked earlier about Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. The White House has renegotiated those deals with the EU, the UK, and Japan to start considering the carbon intensity of traded steel and aluminum explicitly as a way to check Chinese oversupply of those goods in the market. We're using climate policies and climate considerations to reshape our trade deals and reduce our dependency, excuse me, on dirtier Chinese suppliers. There's also bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. Excuse me. Senator Kramer authored an op-ed with H.R. McMaster at the end of last year, making the case for aligning with our allies on climate and trade policies as a check on our rivals. And Senator Kuhn, last summer, he introduced, excuse me, he introduced a piece of legislation that would impose a border carbon adjustment, sort of isolated from any advancement in domestic climate policy as a way to make sure we can leverage our existing carbon advantage. The appetite is here. Policymakers are moving. They're looking for the right solution sets to implement. To sum this up, border carbon adjustments align climate ambition with the economic success of the United States and create a new opening to amp up global climate ambition. We talk a lot about border carbon adjustments. They are the best understood tool at this nexus, but we want to add more options on the table as the policy environment is evolving and the political conversation is expressing an appetite. Policies that connect climate and trade can unlock new benefits for the US, the global environment, and our allies, which means we should move forward. And then there's great support from voters and from leaders in Washington. Great appetite to start taking action on the opportunities in this space. I'm really eager for your questions. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Catrina. That was really fascinating. We do have some questions already in the chat. And if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat right now. Make sure it's sent to everyone so that the Republican staff can see it and put it in the queue. So let's see, let's just dive into the questions here. Catrina's first question is from Thomas. He says, how important is regulatory rollback for sustained Republican support for a carbon tax with dividend and border adjustment?
It's an interesting question. At the Climate Leadership Council, the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan, the policy that we have developed and advocate for, includes regulatory simplification as one of its 4 policy ingredients. And that's for a variety of reasons. One of them, as you mentioned, is that we want to build Republican support, and Republicans are very concerned with the costs associated with regulation on carbon from existing facilities. There's also a policy justification for this, which is that a carbon fee is the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the economy. There is no more efficient tool. And so allowing the carbon fee to be the driver of emissions reductions rather than a suite of regulations provides a lot of opportunity for the marketplace to be sure about the investments it makes today for decarbonization tomorrow. It's a policy component that we include. You can read more about it in the climate roadmap that we have at clcouncil.org.
All right. See, we have Kevin. He's asking about some politicians such as Senator Kramer, who has suggested imposing a carbon border adjustment without a domestic carbon price. So how might that work? Could it possibly be WTO consistent? Is it necessary to have a domestic price first or simultaneously?
Thanks. So I'm going to wear 2 hats here. The Climate Leadership Council hat says that the best way to impose a border carbon adjustment is to build one into a domestic carbon fee so that we're leveling the playing field and we're associating the very same carbon costs with all goods sold in the US economy. But my Center for Climate and Trade hat wants to say that any policy innovation and creativity in this space is moving the conversation forward and in the right direction. So let's think about what these policies might look like at the border. I laid out a couple of tools that we think we know are available to connect climate and trade, things like Section 232 national security tariffs, things like carbon clubs, things like anti-dumping and countervailing duties. But there might also be a way to create, let's say, sectoral arrangements where we establish performance standards. And if you can't beat the performance standard for the US economy, then you'd have to pay some carbon fee at the border. It's a really interesting question about WTO consistency, about who would bring suit at the WTO over a climate policy that's designed to amp up climate ambition, especially as all of the parties to the WTO are also parties to the UNFCCC and that climate diplomacy process. But more creativity and entrepreneurship in innovating these tools is going to help us figure out how we can start acting today, even without a carbon price, to more closely align our climate policies and frankly, our climate successes with the trade tools that we are already using today.
Okay, Griffin is wondering if the council has examined the auto industry if we impose a domestic carbon fee and a border carbon adjustment.
So we haven't done any specific analysis, but the industry is very interesting to consider. To date, most border carbon adjustment policies have been focused on the basket of energy-intensive trade-exposed goods. That includes legislation introduced on Capitol Hill. It includes the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where the border measure would apply to primary goods, to carbon-intensive inputs, to things like automobiles, which means that a US manufactured automobile would bear the carbon costs for all of its inputs made in US facilities or imported from overseas. And so a US made automobile will have the carbon costs embedded in it, which may not be the case for imported automobiles. And so this industry in particular lets us think about how broad a border carbon adjustment should be, not just for environmental considerations, not just to ensure that we're properly monetizing our carbon advantage, but to be realistic given the way supply chains presently operate. It's a very interesting industry to study because of this new angle it gives us in thinking about the scope of a potential border carbon adjustment or other trade measure.
Thank you. Next question is from Rob. He says, this all sounds very appealing conceptually, but seems very difficult to implement in real life. Who determines the carbon intensity of the hundreds of thousands or millions of imported and exported goods? What is the adjudication mechanism for inevitable disagreements and disputes over these computations?
So the short answer is at clcouncil.org, we have a paper called Don't Believe the Hype. And I answered just those questions, but maybe I'll give a little bit of a longer answer. So we have, I guess I'm going to break this into two questions, the carbon measurement question and the administrative question. So we have a lot of data associated with carbon emissions across the globe, right? We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Standards that ensures that we have country level emissions data. You can quibble about the quality, but we have it for every country. We have a lot of facility level data. More than 40 countries have requirements for the regular reporting of the greenhouse gas emissions at individual facilities. Many of those 40 countries also include verification requirements, which means there's an infrastructure in place to weigh whether they're accurate with those measurements. 92% of Fortune 500 companies presently use the greenhouse gas protocol to assess the carbon intensity of their operations. There's a lot of data that we have to draw from. We also have an existing trading system where we're settling disputes constantly, where we're applying specific tariff rates to individual goods imported from specific countries of origin. There's an architecture that we can build into that helps us sort of get over the hurdle about what is the right way to identify a good and where it comes from. What is the right way to make an alternate claim, right? What is the right way to settle any claims made? We have a trading system that allows us to think through those opportunities and to build on an existing administrative model to make the border carbon adjustment a lot easier to implement than you might think.
Okay, we're going to take a little break from audience questions and throw it over to Bob. Bob, do you have any questions you would like to ask Catrina?
Yeah, Catrina, tell us a little bit more about the exciting stuff you're telling us on the podcast with Chelsea Henderson, our host there, about the advantage of American manufacturing. The one that stuck out to me was steel, because I'm from South Carolina, and we have Nucor steel, for example, down in the low country of South Carolina. And there's some big numbers involved here in terms of increased sales of American steel if we get to the place of recognizing how clean it is compared to other steel. And not to say that steel is a wonderfully clean thing. I'm not saying that, but some steel is cleaner than others, right? And but it's a very practical thing. It stuck for me because it makes sense to South Carolinians.
Thanks, Bob. So I showed you that slide with sort of national level numbers across economic sectors where the US has a carbon advantage, but the sectors that I include there are highly aggregated. So we can't sort of break this available international trade data down into specific goods categories. And not all industries have really sophisticated reporting systems that allow us to peek behind the curtain. There's a lot of proprietary data out there. And so we first went after the steel industry. A market intelligence firm called CRU has a proprietary data set with a whole bunch of attributes associated with individual steelmaking facilities all over the world. Every steel manufacturer is included in their database, and they recently added the ability to assess the carbon intensity of steel made at those facilities based on, I'm going to use some jargon here, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So the emissions from those individual facilities based on the energy that they're making on site. And scope 2 emissions, the emissions associated with the electricity that they consume to make steel on site. The end result that we got from our analysis with CRU was that we're cutting imports in half, that we're boosting the manufacture of the sales of US made steel and the profitability of US made steel. And that happens because the US steel industry has already deployed a whole lot of measures to ensure that the carbon intensity of US made steel is lower than that of our competitors. These investments have already been made. We have a choice about whether or not we monetize that existing carbon advantage in the steel industry, and as I showed in the carbon advantage, very many others. But there's a limit to the analysis that I showed. One is that I was looking at a snapshot in time, so a counterfactual. What if a border carbon adjustment and carbon fee had existed? That's the circumstance where we're cutting imports and boosting sales. I want to know what happens over the long term. What kind of new investment can we inject into the US steel industry to widen the gap and to make sure that we're making more of our steel demand here at home, that we're making more of international steel demand here at home with cleaner practices. I also want to know how we can keep that carbon advantage going. The carbon advantage that exists already is terrific, and we can and should monetize it. But as soon as we do, there will be incentives in place for international competitors to also start adopting carbon efficient practices, reduce the carbon intensity of steel that they want to import to the US market. And so this is an opportunity for us not just to monetize an existing advantage, but to build in policies that will help us widen the carbon advantage over time so that we're driving more and more possible investment in US made clean steel than in imported product, than in steel manufactured in dirtier facilities overseas. It's a new opportunity that we can unlock. And then let me just add one more thing, which is that if you think about these renegotiated Section 232 steel and aluminum agreements with the EU, the UK, and Japan, we're looking at an opportunity to account for the carbon intensity of steel manufactured, of manufactured steel in our trade relationships. This is explicitly, in the case of the EU deal, designed to check an oversupply of dirtier Chinese-made steel and aluminum. This oversupply of steel and aluminum is designed to put cleaner US and EU firms out of business. And if we can use climate policy to make those businesses more competitive and check the Chinese-made oversupply, it's a gain for the climate, it's a gain for clean firms, it's a gain for US jobs.
Yeah, very interesting. And Catrina, how do we get past with the fact that the Chinese see us coming? In other words, they've probably read your studies and they know and that they've got a problem. But how do we make sure it's in their interest to join us in pricing carbon dioxide? Is that part of what happens here with the carbon border adjustment?
Yes, a unilateral US carbon adjustment can go a whole long way to encourage individual firms internationally to make a cleaner product so that they're competitive in the US market. That is absolutely a benefit that we can and should unlock with unilateral action. But if we join with our partners, right, we listed the US, the European Union, the UK, Japan, and Canada. If all 5 of these countries start moving together to address the greenhouse gas emissions associated with traded goods, then 53% of the global consumer economy cares about the carbon emissions associated with the goods that they consume. Creates a new leverage point. And at this point, we're not just incentivizing individual firms to maybe make a subset of product for competition in a cleaner market, but we're changing fundamentally the rules of global trade so that carbon intensity is important. We're getting trade out of the way of climate progress and orienting it towards greater climate ambition. And it's inescapable that such a move will impact the way even recalcitrant countries like China manufacture their products, the way that they make investments in new facilities and retrofits to existing facilities.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for that question, Bob. Let's see, back to the audience here. Okay, Alden asked something, it's sort of along the same lines of what you were just talking about, but he says, while the EU, the UK, and the US and Canada are a great place to start, we also need to engage India, China, and other countries with carbon-intensive heavy industries. Could the German Climate Club proposal be a way to start with the G7 countries, but then move out to other major emitters, perhaps through the Indonesian G20 presidency? What value can the clean energy ministerial and mission innovation deliver on this front? The US is chairing both of these multilateral processes this year.
Hi, Alden. A great question. Yes. So I failed to mention it when I had the slide up, but this basket of 4 countries in the European Union moving forward, that's the G7 already. And so Germany is going to use its presidency of the G7 for the coming year to explore this question about carbon clubs, this nature of collaborating on climate and trade within the G7. And Alden mentions additional international forums that we can use to explore this nexus and to explore how to extract mutual benefit across a variety of countries with very different economies. And we, yes, can and should deploy conversations in all of them. We also need to make significant progress on how we serve those conversations. A border carbon adjustment has been explored in the literature since about 2008 at a great level of detail, a lot of policy proposals to grow from. Now the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism has draft language out. We understand this tool very well. We don't understand how to use other tools very well. We need to do a better job of telling the story in data about the opportunity for carbon efficient countries and for less carbon efficient countries to more closely align with clean economies. We need to explore policy tools and how to use those policy tools towards cooperation. We don't quite know how to do that yet. What can we bring to these international forums that shows the opportunities at the nexus, that builds bridges to our collaborators overseas? Frankly, we need a lot more sort of pen to paper from the DC policy environment so that these conversations can happen and be productive.
Jessie is asking this question. She says, a BCA creates a comparative advantage that currently benefits the EU and the US, given the relative carbon intensities of production. The US and the EU would come out ahead. However, the carbon intensity of production in the US and EU is still well outside of being in alignment with a 1.5 degree pathway. So how would BCA help raise the bar in the US on the timeline that we need? Also, Jesse asks, where would the funds collected from tariffs go?
I'll answer this question with my Climate Leadership Council hat on. A border carbon adjustment deployed with an ambitious domestic carbon fee will bend the curve on domestic emissions and exert the influence, the lever that we want on the international economy as well. Climate and trade measures will be most effective when they are paired with ambitious climate policies. We can't sort of disentangle the opportunity to widen the carbon advantage and keep that wide carbon advantage persistent over time with the development of smart policies at home, like the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan. That also gives us an idea for what to do with the revenue. We can disperse it just as we would the revenue from a domestic carbon fee. In the case of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan, that would be a quarterly dividend to American households. I've heard additional ideas on how to use the revenues. This is moving to the sort of policy exploration space. Can we use those revenues to support the uptake of carbon efficient technologies made in the US and installed overseas? Can we use them to help our least developed country allies along? How do we use those revenues in a way that advances international cooperation and the uptake of US made goods abroad? That's a really interesting area to explore. But without a doubt, if this policy is implemented with a domestic carbon fee, it's going to go a lot further to ensuring that we'll be able to continue monetizing a persistent carbon advantage over time.
All right. So our podcast host, Chelsea Henderson, has a question for you that she didn't get to ask you during your other interview. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Hi, Catrina. Nice to see you. Thanks for doing this. So I think I would have made a great whip in Congress because I love vote counting and trying to sort of put people in categories of for, against, and on the fence. So what do the numbers look like? I was really encouraged to see Senator Kramer's op-ed, and he made some comments last week that were positive about a BCA. But where, do you think that you have enough support to get one, especially through the Senate, and then, which I know can be the problem child, and then just generally, like what kind of momentum do you see and political support do you see, and how long will it really take us to get there? And will we blow it? I know that was a lot of ways of saying the same thing, but.
Oh, thanks, Chelsea. It's good to see you. I'm going to leave that last question aside and say time will tell. But the political conversation is moving very quickly in a very encouraging direction. We've seen, I put up a slide that had the interest of 2 senators expressed on it. We have had conversation with dozens of congressional offices that are really interested to understand the good news story in America's carbon advantage and want to figure out what can they do to help monetize that carbon advantage. Maybe they're not ready to offer specific policies. Again, the DC policy community needs to do a lot more work to make these conversations easy and successful, but they're very motivated by the opportunity to talk about climate change as an economic policy tool, to highlight the existing climate successes that we've had in the US with investments in efficiency. We're really good at that in the US economy, with innovative processes and with the decarbonization of our electricity system. They see a whole lot of opportunities for themselves here. And this is across the aisle, right? So we have an opportunity to use this like America First populist language to talk about the climate and trade opportunity. And we've got a terrific opportunity to talk about the deployment, the more aggressive deployment schedule for the technologies that we already know how to use well. There's something in this conversation for everyone. And it's been really encouraging to see the sort of olive branches extended across the aisle to find odd bedfellows and explore what's doable here at the climate and trade nexus.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea. Well, I'm going to step in with my own question, which is, I feel like this is a great policy tool when you look at it, just like academics and economists, and but the regular American, I feel like, they've never heard of such a thing. They don't quite understand it. It's a little bit wonky. I'm just wondering, is it important at all to try to get buy-in from the general American public on this, or is this just something that the politicians will do at a legislative level and the average American might not even be aware that it's happening? If it is important to get some public support, how can we communicate this in a way that the average American would care and understand?
It's a great question, Wen. And the really cool part is that American buy-in is already there. So the polling that we did targeted swing states, and it found very broad bipartisan interest in border carbon adjustments. We used that term in the polling, but we also explained it. And the explanation brings everybody in, right? So it's a tool for holding overseas emitters accountable for the first time for their emissions. It's a tool that we can use to benefit cleaner US manufacturers and the jobs that they create. And there was such strong interest in deploying this tool in the United States something like 80% of respondents said that they would be more likely to support a political candidate that talked about a border carbon adjustment associated with domestic climate policy. And in the slide I was talking about earlier, we had this figure that completely astonished me, that 75% of Americans would be willing to pay more for a good if that good was made in the US with a lower carbon footprint. Here we can tap into this interest in boosting the US economy by supporting domestic firms and align that existing interest with climate policy. It makes it not just easier to sell to a broad American audience, but it makes it a very tangible benefit that they're interested in tapping into. I'll also note that when you get survey responses, it's usually a spectrum of 5. So like very strongly in favor and weakly in favor and neutral and weakly against and strongly against. Our strongly in favor numbers I have never seen for climate policy. The intensity of support for holding overseas emitters accountable and for supporting clean US made firms is unprecedented in the polling that I've seen about how to address climate emissions in the United States.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. Thanks for telling us all that. Let's see, we have time for just a couple more questions. Lawrence in the audience, he asks, how can a BCA incentivize US companies to produce critical resources?
I think I get the question. Sorry, it's translating in my head. So by ensuring that we're giving the most benefit possible to the cleanest producers, it means that we're conferring benefit on existing clean operators. So we're asking them to level up their production. So the manufacturers of critical and strategic minerals in the United States now have a leg up on their competition because the prices are better for cleaner product. And because the prices are better for cleaner product, we're encouraging more cleaner producers to come online and start making the same goods in a lower carbon manner. And that's the impulse that we want to see. We want to pull on more capacity into the US market because you can do it cleaner and better and then cheaper in the United States.
All right. Sylvia just asked, well, if there's so much support in the polling, what is holding things up?
A terrific question. And again, I'll just say, maybe I haven't done my job well enough. We need to encourage these creative policy exploration conversations. A border carbon adjustment associated with a domestic carbon fee is going to be really hard to swallow all in one go. The most likely next step that we take at the Climate and Trade Nexus won't be that kind of comprehensive economy-wide policy, but we don't know what it will be. And so at the Center for Climate and Trade, we'll be doing the exploration work necessary to answer exactly that question. What can Congress do first? Because support is there and they're very eager to tap it.
Wonderful. And the last question I will give to Bob Inglis because he just wants to ask you one more.
Yeah, Catrina, I should have asked you to explain what the center is going to do. So tell us a little bit about the center that you're now running at the Climate Leadership Council.
I'd be thrilled, Bob. So at the council, we developed the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan in conversation with a group of founding members, companies, environmental NGOs, and bipartisan individuals who would help us shape the policy. And we learned a lot about the value of that kind of model in asking better and more interesting questions about policy design. And so that's what we're going to do at the center. I have a lot of questions about how to connect climate and trade, identify, explore the opportunities at the nexus, innovate policies, and I want to ask those questions with as broad an audience as possible. And so we're assembling a group of collaborators from across the spectrum, industry interests, environmental interests, labor interests, who will be very valuable to this conversation, and explore what questions we have at the nexus, many of which came up today, and then identify the resources that we can use to sort of push the envelope here. What data exists and we don't know how to use it well yet? What policies do we use in the trade space every day that the climate conversation just doesn't understand quite yet? What is old hat for climate world, but the trade community doesn't know how to translate into policy? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to answer. I'm thrilled to say we have 3 co-chairs who are helping shape the policy work at the Center for Climate and Trade. They include Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, who used her time as the US Trade Representative under Bill Clinton to bring China to the WTO, and has enormously valuable perspectives on what the global economy means for climate, for trade. We have Jennifer Hillman. She spent time at the International Trade Commission, but she was also one of the 7 members of the WTO appellate body, and she's got tremendous scholarship at the nexus of climate and trade already based on what she learned in her time there and what she thinks is possible at this sort of political, diplomatic trade forum that the WTO is. And Jim Connaughton, who served under George W. Bush as the head of the Council on Environmental Quality and has spent a lot of time thinking about the other side of the trade coin. How do we make more clean things here in the US and encourage their uptake overseas? How do we use trade as an instrument to get more American innovations into global decarbonization? So there's a lot of work ahead for the center. I'm excited to tell you more about it next time we check in.
Thank you, Catrina. This was a really fascinating and really enlightening presentation. I really learned so much, and I hope everyone else did too. So thank you, Catrina, for your time and sharing your expertise and knowledge. Thank you, everyone, for joining today to learn about this important topic, and I hope we continue the conversation again soon. So we will send out a recording of this to everyone. You'll get an email from Angela later today, and you'll be able to watch it again, share it with everyone. But yeah, let's get the word out and let's get things moving. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Catrina. And I hope everyone has a good day. Bye-bye now. Thank you.